Greetings, you loyal, you curious Herle Burly-ites. We've got an MP alert on the pod today. The Honourable Marco Mendicino has graciously made some time for us. Marco has been since 2015 the Member of Parliament for Eglinton Lawrence in Toronto. He served in the cabinet as both the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship and more recently Minister of Public Safety. Before public life, he was a federal prosecutor for more than a decade. My lips are starting to work like Biden's. And it's both his personal experiences and his political experience in the latter cabinet portfolio, public safety, that's going to inform the discussion we're having today. In the wake of last weekend's Trump assassination attempt, I want to explore this visceral and growing issue of political violence, as well as dive into the broader issues of national security and public safety. What's fueling the vitriol and behavior? How do we mitigate it? What's the government's role? What are the politicians' roles? What is the public's role? As I said, Marco has firsthand experience with all of it, so who better to talk about it? Plus, we might delve into politics just a little bit at the end of this interview, so stay tuned. Marco Mendicino, welcome to the Herle Burly.
Hey there. You recognize that intro?
The Larry Sanders Show.
Hey there.
How you doing, brother?
I'm doing okay. You know, personally, I'm fit, as some of our mutual friends have observed on your show. But I, worried about all the stuff around politics and in government. But I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm at the cottage, trying to get some dock time in from between meetings and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like the tough life.
It is. You know what? It's very tough. It's very tough.
It shows.
Podcast hosting is one of the most grueling jobs possible.
I can tell. I can tell. Lots of accommodation required.
All right. So listen, the Trump assassination attempt has everybody thinking about the safety of public officials. You've been at the center of these things here in Canada in a number of ways. Can you talk about what you have experienced?
Well, first on Trump, I watched it like you did, and it was horrifying. It was a bit like watching a dystopian movie come to life, and I think we've always observed about Trump that he's often blurred the surreal with the real. His career before politics, on The Apprentice and all of that, and becoming president, I think was certainly a watershed moment. I remember when he was first elected in 2016, how I think the day after, I was one of the only spokes for the government, aside from the prime minister, to welcome him to his new role as president-elect. And so fast forward, he's campaigning again, and he's out there and he's doing the rallies, and then to see him come within a hair width of being assassinated.
Millimeters.
Yeah, millimeters. Absolutely. Was just bone chilling. So I think as Canadians, and you've been in politics, you've been in the game, we tend to think of political violence as occurring somewhere else. And the truth of the matter is that political violence happens here at home in our communities. And the Sergeant at Arms recently reported that the statistics have gone up through the roof, something like 800% in the last 5 years. And I've got some personal experience with that, unfortunately. Me, my family, the people who are around me, my staff. It's very real.
In what form does it take with you, Marco?
Death threats, online death threats almost daily. People who leave messages on the constituency office line. I've had protesters who've shown up and who've crossed the line, engaging directly with my family and my kids. And then most recently, there was an assault in the form of somebody spitting on me on Spark Street as I was walking back from Parliament Hill to my office in Valor Building, which is right at Sparks and O'Connor. And so, this is not abstract. It's real. And I suppose that off the top, I would just say that, there are real people who are involved in this, and we've got to take this issue a hell of a lot more seriously than we have.
Right. So, you were Minister of Public Safety. You were at the middle of the convoy episode and all that kind of thing. So were you a special example, or what kind of threats do other elected officials in Canada deal with?
For sure. Yeah, no, for sure. And being public safety minister, is a very difficult and demanding job. Your friend, my friend, Ralph Goodale would tell you it's probably one of the most difficult jobs in government. It's 24/7. You are dealing with the livelihood and the safety of Canadians every single day. And, that's at the easiest of times. But certainly at the beginning of 2022, with the Freedom Convoy coming to town in Ottawa, rolling in with hundreds of trucks and mobilizing at the border and other communities across the country was a singular event. And so, being in the press and, being the one of the main spokes for the government was absolutely challenging. And people can and should debate the invocation of the Emergencies Act. I know it's a very emotional issue, but the fact of the matter is that for me, that was the right thing to do, but it did certainly put me in the crosshairs of public criticism. And not just me, by the way, my colleagues, again, on all sides of the aisle. This is not a partisan issue. So the consequence of that is that, you get more death threats. You do encounter more frustration and more anger. And that's one of the reasons why I've been speaking out about the need to do more when it comes to keeping people safe in the political arena.
So how do you know, a death threat's kind of a serious thing. What do you do when you get them? I presume most of them are ignored and not investigated. Or are they, or do you have every one of them run down?
Well, I think the law enforcement do their best to prioritize the death threats that they believe are credible. And when that happens, they will inform you. The ones that alarm me the most are the ones that involve my family and my kids. I've got 2 girls, and my thoughts always turn to them. I worry about my colleagues. I worry about the people that that work on the front lines of the constituency offices. So, there are protocols that are in place. I want to be clear about that. And for, I think, the most serious ones, there are investigations and there are charges. But I think that we do need to really look hard at whether or not law enforcement have enough people on the ground, and not only the RCMP and PPES, the Parliamentary Protective Service in Ottawa, but also the local police of jurisdiction in our constituencies. And that's actually the area I'm really concerned about. And making sure that the lines of communication are strong, that coordination is strong when these incidents happen, that there is a quick response to protect folks.
Right. All right. I want to get into that in a minute, but I do want to understand what this issue is a little bit more first. So death threats are obviously across any line possible. What about other things? What about the vandalization of constituency offices? What about sort of intimidation in public spheres? Is this normal and acceptable, or is this a new phenomenon that is concerning as well?
It's not normal, but it is being normalized. And I think there are a number of factors that are contributing to that phenomenon. One is extreme rhetoric, and this is a device that is used by many folks within politics. And
everybody. How about everybody?
I think everybody engages in it to a degree. I don't think it's terribly constructive to be pointing fingers at this particular juncture. I think everyone needs to look in the mirror and ask themselves whether or not they can do better when it comes to raising the bar of public debate. That's one. 2 would be the proliferation of conspiracy theories on all subjects: the economy, climate change, healthcare, navigating COVID, all of the above.
Right.
How we keep people safe. And I think it's important that the work that media do, acting as a bulwark and as a fact checker, so that Canadians can be informed and can separate what's true and what's not, is critically important. So those are 2 factors. And by normalizing, what I'm really getting at is that when you dehumanize your political opponent, it gives license to others to treat people in an inhumane way. And that manifests through intimidation, harassment, and even violence.
Right. So, well, let me take a step back first. You said an all sides thing, but I know in the circles that I travel in, people are inclined to attribute this kind of thing more to the extreme right of the political spectrum than to other portions of the political spectrum. But I don't know that that's true. Do you get a sense that these kind of threats are coming from multiple places on the political spectrum, or just one place on the political spectrum?
All places on the political spectrum. I don't buy into this just being a far right problem. We've got far left protesters who I think are crossing the line, for example, on the Middle East. So when you go out and you say things like, my friend and colleague Anthony Housefather, who is a Jewish Canadian, who is a proud Zionist, you call him a terrorist, you call him somebody who promotes genocide, you're dehumanizing him. And by extension, you are, giving license to people to act out against that individual.
Okay,
when it's just simply not true.
In 1967, like 60 years ago, people are out there in the streets going, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Is that not dehumanizing?
I think I think that there are going to be examples that are very clear. So if you're going out there and you're calling somebody a criminal without any basis in fact, then you are feeding into the emotional frenzy, which can lead to violence and certainly can raise the temperature. If you are going out there and you are feeding into conspiracies which you know are untrue for the purposes of torquing debate, you bear some responsibility in whether or not there is additional political violence. So I think that it is important as political leaders in this country to reflect about that. And as for Canadians, look, we live in a democracy. People have a right to protest, and they need to be able to exercise that right robustly. I'm a lawyer by training. I worked in the federal prosecution service. I understand that it is important that we uphold the charter. But where people cross the line, and especially when they are inciting violence for the purposes of doing harm to the people that we elect into political office, there have to be consequences. And in my judgment, we just have not seen enough of that recently. I mean, just in the last 24 hours, you were talking about constituency offices. Again, another very good friend and colleague of mine, Mark Miller, had his constituency office completely demolished. Now, that's not only a threat to him, that is a threat to his staff, and it is equally a threat to the constituents that he serves. So we need police to investigate, find the criminals that did this, charge them, prosecute them, and make sure that they are appropriately punished to deter future incidents.
Right. So this business about dialing back the rhetoric, I mean, let's zoom in on the most difficult aspect of this, which would be Trump. So in the aftermath of the assassination, Trump supporters are saying that the Democrats and Biden stimulated this through the extreme rhetoric they use about Trump and the existential challenge that people believe he represents to the United States as they know it and to the world order as they know it. So how is one to talk about Trump if you're not supposed to be calling out the fact that he represents an existential threat to the existing order?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's, certainly when you get into debating the legitimacy of elections which have been certified as being free and fair by the United States Supreme Court, you really are getting to the core of the challenge. And I would take a step back from Trump because I think what you're really identifying is the gray zone, where people need to be able to exercise the right to free speech, even when it's offensive, and even when there may be occasions where you call into question somebody's integrity, what their principles are, what their values are, but that is not unlawful. And the best answer that I can offer you, David, and I've been giving this a lot of thought because I am speaking up about it. I'm using my voice and my experience to try to figure out what the solutions are, is that it requires the right temperament and good judgment. And I think Canadians are right to demand that from the people that they put into office. Good temperament and good judgment, not to pull punches on the debate about the issues or the people that want to be our political leaders, but to listen to the angels of our better nature before they go feeding into the frenzy that can lead to violence.
So what if I said to you that I think probably maybe rhetoric is hotter now in politics than it used to be. Maybe negative ads are more negative than they used to be. But I think what's more different is the way people respond to this and the way people are acting. Because, Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney were at the end of their tenures terribly, terribly unpopular people. Running terribly, terribly unpopular governments. We're more unpopular than Justin Trudeau's government today. And I mean, there were demonstrations against them, but I don't recall anybody ever thinking that they were in any danger. And I don't recall this kind of attacks on ministers or attacks on constituency offices. People are different, don't you think?
I'm not so sure. I'd push back a little bit on that. I think what's different is the way that we consume information and the volume of disinformation which is being spread on social media. And the other development or evolution since the days of Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Brian Mulroney is social media. And the algorithms and the artificial intelligence, which is driving and pushing out disinformation, which creates these echo chambers, as they have been described, I think, quite aptly in metaphoric terms. And I'm just not sure that as people, we have developed the skills that we need to be able to understand clearly what the impact is of being bombarded with that intense volume of information, which is, on a 24/7 stream in our phones and our tablets, on screens. And so I think that is part of what is contributing to the dehumanization, which can lead to more political violence. And that's one of the reasons why I think, as part of the overall solution to this, we do need to engage social media platforms, because I can tell you they are not safe. And not only for politicians, but for users and for Canadians writ large. They are just not safe.
Right. The clerk of the Privy Council warned us about this a number of years ago, that this was a growing issue, threats to elected officials. But COVID feels like it was accelerant on this fire. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. I remember Michael Wernick's testimony. He described the vomitorium, was the word that he used, that he worried could lead to more violence. And I think he's
Somebody's
right.
going to get shot, he said.
He did say that. It was jarring. It was jarring then, and it's jarring now. And I think in the back of his mind, he was certainly reflecting on the 24 shooting on Parliament Hill and the tragic killing of Nathan Cirillo, the member of the Canadian Armed Forces who was working to guard the National War Memorial in Ottawa. But I also think, he was reflecting about where we are today, and that was now going back, 5 years, David? So it's gotten worse.
Yeah.
And, the statistic that I'd mentioned earlier, which is that the Sergeant at Arms says that threats to parliamentarians has gone up 800%, is an eye-popping number. But I think it's easy to get distracted by the numbers and easy to forget that behind those statistics are real people. So I think he was trying to give a bit of a jolt to parliamentarians to say, and to Canadians to say, look, we need to take this seriously. Yes, it is true. Historically, Canada has been a very safe and stable democracy, but we can't take that for granted. And I echo that sentiment for sure.
Right. On the COVID side, though, like it feels to me like COVID broke something in our society. What do you think that was?
Social cohesion, the ability to relate to one another through, family traditions and customs. I know that we were all kept apart, and kids were kept out of class, and were prevented from going to graduations and to semi-formals, and we were prevented from celebrating.
Going to my brother's funeral.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. I know, I can just imagine, how tough that was. I remember I lost a cousin within the first month of COVID. And, this was long before we had access to vaccines or had a better understanding about how to fight the virus. And, still feel as though those missed opportunities are part of what fractured that cohesion that I was referring to. But I do think that in spite of that we are starting to come back together now and are at a moment where we can have a little bit more perspective about what the long-term effects and consequences of COVID were. And I think it is about understanding what ties us together as Canadians. And I think that in an important way, what we're talking about right now directly relates to that idea that, we can and should have robust debates about the big issues in our political arena, but there should never be a moment at which people feel it's okay to cross the line and to do harm to political leaders or any other Canadian for that matter.
So there's a series of worldwide, super-fast, open-wheeled races I'm not allowed to refer to by name, lest the lawyers turn the Herle Burly into the Herle Burly. But one of them was just run in Montreal, and it's key to this next installment in our summer of fascinating and very useful tech from our presenting sponsor, TELUS. Who's ever heard of a thing called network slicing? No? Let me help. I'm staying with the automobile theme here. Imagine a highway with multiple lanes, each reserved for different types of vehicles. One for emergency vehicles, one for carpools, one for regular cars, one for 1970s wood-paneled station wagons. Forgive the tangent, I have a thing for vintage station wagons. The point is, the whole setup makes for smoother travel for everyone. Network slicing works similarly, but in the digital world. It divides a single physical network into multiple virtual networks, or slices, each customized for specific needs and services. One might prioritize speed for gaming. Another ensures better reliability for emergency services. But the whole thing greatly improves network performance. Back to Montreal's big race. TELUS's very own pit crew created a special 5G priority payment slice. Think of all the concessions and merchandise sales for the massive crowds on site. It was a huge success. Speeds on the slice were faster than the general network traffic, with no interruptions and a minuscule failure rate over 3 days of the event. It's really just the beginning, Herle Burly-ites. TELUS is now exploring network slicing for nationwide digital payment services and event experiences, including the 2026 FIFA World Cup. That's weird. I guess I can call that one by name. Lawyers, don't come at me. Do you know whether there are some issues that provoke these things more than other issues? Like, it seems to me like people don't desecrate constituency offices over the lack of available childcare spaces. So it feels like there's certain types of issues that are more provocative than others.
For sure. And I think historically that people who protest based on, social justice causes those movements can be very intense. And one of the reasons why I think we baked into the charter the right to protest was to allow for people to exercise not only a point of view, but their frustration and their concern. And I think to relate that point to the question that you posed earlier, there will be, I think, some, there will be some cases where it is difficult to know exactly where the line is. But for me, the bright line is around the incitement of hatred and violence. And so I think as passionate as people may be about the Middle East, or as passionate as people may be about vaccine mandates, I mean, those are two obvious examples that I think we've been nibbling around the edges on. There should never be a moment where people feel that it is okay as part of that protest to then cross the line and intimidate, harass, or try to exert some violence on political leaders or their fellow Canadians. And that's really part of the reason why I've been speaking up.
You know, Gaza is a good example because I haven't had a calm, rational conversation with anybody about that issue since it started.
No? Really?
No, it's impossible because most people don't want to talk about it. And the two people that do want to talk about it want to convince you and are angry if they can't. So every conversation I've had about this has degenerated into we have to stop talking about this within minutes.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all experienced that. And certainly in my job as a member of parliament for a Toronto riding where there's a very large and prominent Jewish community, which I'm very proud to represent and work with, sometimes we don't even get to words. You know, my constituency staff have been beleaguered with abuse and harassment, often, which is criminal. And
Right.
so I think this is a perfect example, which is not to say that people don't have a right to disagree with me or the positions that I've taken on behalf of the constituents that I represent. We live in a democracy. You have every right to disagree with the point of view that I take, and I will defend your right to exercise it. But that is never a justification for calling up my office and threatening my staff. That is never a justification for uttering a death threat against me or my family. And that is certainly never going to be a justification for inciting hatred or resorting to anti-Semitism towards my colleagues or to the people that I represent. And I think this is an issue that certainly has gotten very intense. But I also want to be clear, you know, it's an issue that affects many communities. I remember during COVID, the level of anti-Asian racism was going through the roof, in part because of conspiracy theories and standing with the Asian community.
We don't know 100% that it's conspiracy theory, do we?
Well,
the lab theory has not been entirely debunked, as near as I can tell.
Set that aside. Again, that's
I'm coming at you, Marco. I'm coming at you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but you see, this is okay. I don't mind it. This is debate. You're not coming at me with a hatchet, and you're not spitting on me. So there's that.
Yeah.
But look, not to make light of it. I guess what I'm saying is, you can hold these views, but you can't cross the line. And many communities have been impacted by this. I think during COVID, obviously the Asian community was, and I think as well, there have been instances involving the Muslim community. You know, I mean, the family that was mowed down by a radical driver in London, Ontario, having grieved with them, you know, having grieved with the Muslim community in Quebec City. And part of the work that I did as the public safety minister to push forward with important legislative reforms, I think lots of Canadians can relate to being marginalized and stigmatized through hate. And I think this all ties into that discussion because as MPs, our job is to represent those folks. And, you know, we got to be able to have these debates in a way that is free and fair and obviously robust, but, you know, never in a way that leads to violence. All right. You mentioned getting spit on. We've got a clip. Yeah. Let's roll it.
What a piece of shit, girl! What a piece of shit! Hey, good. Oh, jeez. That doesn't seem very nice. Yeah. Come here. Okay. Why are you spitting on our MPs? I didn't mean to. Sir? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Apologize to the message.
I will.
Register.
Yeah, I didn't mean to. But I'm sorry. I'm frustrated because I'm just very upset.
You agree I put my hand
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I apologize. And I apologize. I'm sorry. Have a great night.
So, what do you make of that at the end? What was going on there at the end? Why wasn't he still angry with you? Why was he afraid of the cop, or was he genuinely having rethought what he did?
Don't know. And I didn't know whether or not when he initially approached me, he had a knife or a gun. One of the reasons I was concerned was that I know in my travels that those situations can be volatile. And so I thought that by putting my hand out, I could de-escalate the situation rather than get into a physical confrontation, which, trust me, was the last thing that I wanted. And it certainly seemed to me that the way that I handled that situation was far better than the alternative. And so, I stayed on scene. As you saw, the incident occurred right in front of the Parliamentary Protective Service. The police who were there.
Who was the woman with you?
She wasn't with me. I think she was with the protest. She was with the protesters.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So what you don't actually see is that there are other individuals who are beginning to swarm around, who are part of the protesting crew. And
okay, I didn't see that.
And so, I've actually come to see some of them quite frequently on the Hill, and they obviously know who I am. But in this particular instance, this guy chose to act out, and
he was part of the convoy, wasn't he?
I don't know. Again, I don't know the individual by name. I know that he's been. I think I've seen some coverage that would suggest that he was part of the Freedom Convoy. In any event, so you didn't see that. You did. What happened was a few of them recognized me and then called out, and then more started to show up, and then that's when you see him come up to me as I'm walking into the office, and then I put my hand out, and then he spits on me. So it's obviously disgusting. It's against the law. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking really two things. One,
it's really disgusting, by the way.
Yeah, it's gross. But it's two things. One, how do I de-escalate this situation? And two, if it does get into a physical confrontation, I just want to make sure I get home to see my kids and my family. And so those are the things that go through your mind, because we are living, I think, in a much more volatile period. And I think it also illustrates.
He thought he could do it with impunity, though, right?
Well, that kind of ties into what I was going to get at. It does illustrate that the parliamentarians are exposed. That even in the precinct where you've got a much greater police presence, that there isn't that degree of protection that you would typically see around the prime minister or ministers, and therefore, I think we really need to give some thought to whether or not there are enough resources, whether or not there are enough boots on the ground, and not only in Ottawa, in the parliamentary precinct, but especially back in the constituency offices where you've got different police of jurisdiction.
Right. I want to talk for a minute about sustainability. I know that word can often smack of virtue signaling, but what I want to talk about is no joke. It's not like we have to look very far these days to see the damage climate change is inflicting. So much of the world, to quote a book, is hot, dry, and flat. Remember the old advice from decades ago? Think globally, act locally? Well, our sponsor, CN, is trying to do just that. CN is, pretty huge. It has a carbon footprint like any other big company, and it is shrinking it. Basically, the railway has concluded that the single most effective thing it can do is to improve locomotive operating efficiency. That is happening. Since 1993, locomotive carbon emissions are down 43%. CN trains are consuming 15% less fuel per gross ton than the industry average, and carbon reduction from electricity consumption at CN rail yards is down 33%. There are all sorts of methods at play here, using fewer trains to move more cargo, driving efficiency across the supply chain, using leading-edge tech, and upgrading the CN fleet. As you might expect, there's a grand plan behind all this. CN wants to reach net zero by 2050 and is taking a science-based approach to accomplish that. Every year, it publishes its progress using various metrics. It's happening. 17% here, 20% there, even 30% of the goal has been reached according to certain measures. And CN has managed to divert nearly all the waste it produces away from landfills. Oh, it's also in the process of planting 3 million trees within the next 6 years. This stuff is about as serious as it gets. CN has neither the ability nor the inclination to hector or push other big players in the North American economy to preserve our world for our kids. It's just doing what it can and following the plan. So the Prime Minister and the Cabinet may have better security, and I'm not that familiar with the kind of security Mr. Trudeau has, but I was very familiar with the kind of security Mr. Martin had. And when I watched the Trump thing and the criticisms of the way security was handled at the Trump thing, it looked to me like our PMs are pretty vulnerable with their small security forces and all the open air events that they do.
Yep. I mean, I worry about it. And
they travel with a handful of security people.
They do.
Right?
They do it. Yeah.
I don't know how much searching of the perimeter there is going on.
No, like listen, I mean, I'm not going to get into the details of the operations because that is obviously very sensitive information. But I do know they do a top job. They go out and they scout and they make sure that the PM is able to ingress and egress, to use the technical terms, from the event as safely and as securely as possible. But knowing the Prime Minister, I mean, he wants to be accessible, and I commend him because there are a lot of people who also want to protest him in a vitriolic way, in a way that is over the line. So I wouldn't even describe it as a balancing exercise so much as it is a tight wire act. It's really, really tough. And the RCMP have, they operate in a zero fail environment, especially when it comes to the Prime Minister and the ministers who are, high profile, people who work in those positions where you're part of those intense debates on the issues that we've been discussing. So, I think about Melanie Joly and, the fact that she had her home protested, or Arif Farani, who had his home protested, Dr. Theresa Tam, who's not elected, but is a public figure, she had her home protested. These are all examples where the RCMP and the police of jurisdiction have to get it right 100% of the time. Otherwise, the system fails and you are into a crisis.
You're proposing that we need new legislation. What would that do and how would it help?
So I'm proposing three things. One is more support for law enforcement, and that takes two different forms. One is more boots on the ground, but two, more authorities. And specifically, I think we should look at...
Wait, stop. Let's take the boots on the ground first, then.
Yeah.
Since you put that on the table, what are you exactly envisioning? The PM and cabinet being more isolated, more surrounded by people? Are you security with members of parliament? What are you thinking about?
I think the PM and ministers are getting the protection that they need. I'm more concerned for individual MPs and constituency offices and staff at this point. And there's just, by sheer volume, more work to do there. So I think we need more boots on the ground, not only for the RCMP, but also for local police. And that's one. And I think embedded in that is also strong coordination with the cooperation of the Sergeant at Arms, who is responsible for security on the Hill, but who is also hooked into the local police of jurisdiction. So for a guy like me, a Toronto MP, working very closely with the Toronto Police Service, which we do, and I value that relationship a lot. But I also think we need to heed the calls of the RCMP Commissioner, Mike Duhaime, who said, look, we could probably use some additional laws on the books. And I agree. And I think having protective zones, which would delineate a geographic perimeter around constituency offices, as well as the private residences or homes of MPs, is a way in which to say very strongly that if you engage in the intimidation, harassment, or exerting violence towards parliamentarians in that space, you're going to face even stronger sentences. And going back to my days as a federal prosecutor, I think that is a way to use deterrence to really collectively condemn this kind of conduct. So that's one. Two, we've already talked about, which is engaging with social media platforms. And then three, we've also talked about, which is really looking in the mirror as politicians and seeing whether or not there's a way for us to tone down some of the extreme rhetoric and raise the quality of the debate on the substance. So I think those are the three things we need to do.
I really struggle with that part of it because I don't know what it means. Like, I mean, I think that if you went around and saying X politician is going to take away your pension if they're elected, and that is a true thing to say, and then somebody attacks them over that, you say you provoked them. Well, you're talking about the relevant issues. I mean, I think on social media, things get extreme. People call each other traitors and stuff like that. But I don't know that the politicians, I don't know how much, like, first of all, what is the relationship between this and mental health? Because to be honest, if you go and attack a politician over something, I don't really believe you're just angry. I think you've got some issues.
Well, I'm no expert, but I imagine there is a pretty strong relationship, and the rise in mental health issues has become well documented, particularly post-COVID. And certainly if you are experiencing a mental health issue or are challenged in your mental faculties or capacity, that might lead to the kind of acting out that we've been talking about. But I also want to come back to the original premise of your question, which is this business about how we debate the issues and the gray zone. Yeah. And that is the hardest part of this debate. There's no question about it. So let's take your hypothetical where you're talking about pensions.
Yep.
Perfectly fine for a politician to come forward and say, I'm going to put forward legislation which gets rid of the pensions. We can no longer afford it. That's fine. And perfectly fine for a politician on the other side of the aisle to say, I'm going to fight you tooth and nail on that because you're going to put in jeopardy the livelihood and the safety of other Canadians. I think that is completely fair game. And fair to be emotional about it, and fair even to call into question the motives of the other individual, et cetera. But what's not okay is to either online, where you can hide behind a keyboard or your phone, or directly in the community to say that so-and-so is trying to take away or kill your pension, and therefore we got to take them out, and let's go storm the Bastille, and you know what, we're going to show up at the office, and we're going to storm into the office, and we're going to make them feel our pain to the point that they get it. I mean, that I think really gets to the core of the problem, because nothing that I have said there is explicitly, violent. Somebody could say, well, they're speaking in metaphoric terms. Right? They're really just talking about rallying the troops around the cause. But if somebody, quote unquote, reads between the lines and takes those words literally and then shows up at the constituency office and storms past the staff and, attacks the parliamentarian who is proposing to take away the pension, then that's obviously against the law. And you could make the case that part of the reason why we got there was because of all of the incendiary language around the events that led to that incident. So,
we can't use metaphors anymore. So Lester Holt was busting Biden's balls about having used the term bullseye. Bullseye and crosshairs have been used as metaphors that don't mean shooting somebody for years and years and years and years. As long as I've been alive, you've been able to say those things without implying that somebody ought to be shot.
Agreed. And I think that those will continue to be metaphors which find themselves inside the boundaries of free speech. I think at the same time, context is important. And so if you take that language and you couple it with an image of a bullseye and you put it on somebody's face and you say, take them out,
Well,
are you inciting violence? And
Right.
I think this is where we are getting into the gray zone. So I'm not saying that there are clear-cut answers for every one of these hypotheticals. There isn't, which is why I come back to, as I think about it, that it really comes down to those two things, which is, exercising some good judgment, right? And really, recognizing the responsibility that we have as politicians in the way that we use some of these language and these metaphors to advance the debate.
Right. All right. Hey, brother, before we wrap up, you up for a little politics?
No, I thought we were going to just talk about, going for drinks and beers with Scott Reed, because I hear he was taking a knock at my beer drinking recently. So if that's what you mean by politics, I'm all for it.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you can drink Reed under the table. There's no doubt about that.
I doubt it.
Anybody who's half a man can do that. But listen, honest to God, how do you assess Liberal prospects in the next election?
What are we, 9 years in?
Yep.
We got a huge uphill battle. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. Can it be done? For sure. But it's going to be hard. And you're talking to somebody who knows the ground game, who works the community very hard. And I think we all know that there is a 10-year rule, a 9 or 10-year rule that starts to kick in, and we're starting to experience it. But I'm not a defeatist. I know it's going to be very hard. And so we got to be really focused on, how we chart out the course forward.
My whole experience in politics, with the exceptions of the 1984 election and of the 2011 election, was that the Liberals were going to win Ontario. It was only a question of how much we were going to win how much the Liberals were going to win Ontario by. Current polls show us more than 20 points down in Ontario. Stunning development. What has turned Ontarians so decisively against the government?
I think there's fatigue. I think there's a sense that we've got to get our message back on track. And, there's no doubt in my mind that some of that has a lot to do with the relationship between people and the Prime Minister, and I think he understands and acknowledges that. So there's a lot wrapped into that. And knowing Ontario as I do, I was on the National Steering Committee for the Prime Minister in 21, and then the Ontario co-chair in 2019. I think Ontarians, like most Canadians, want us to focus on pocketbook issues. Inflation is starting to slow, which is good, but still costs a lot to pay the food bill, to go to the gas pump. So we've got to get back to those issues. I think we've got some real thinking through as to whether or not our economic agenda is resonating in Ontario and beyond. But that's not the only issue. I mean, I do think that there is a fatigue there that is really setting in. And you experienced this at the tail end with the Ontario Liberal government in 2018, and it's a tough thing to turn around. Like there's no doubt in my mind that we're thinking about that particular moment and whether or not there's any lessons that we can take away from it so that we can turn this ship around.
Well, can it be turned around under Trudeau, or does he have to leave?
I think he understands full well that the status quo ain't working.
Fuck, you sound like a Democrat talking about Biden right now.
Is there news about is there stuff going on with Biden? I missed that. Tell me more. What's going on with Biden?
No, you're talking right now.
Look, listen. PM is a fighter. I think people get that. he's not a throw the towel in kind of guy. I also think coming into the political arena himself, he was drastically underestimated, and I think that explains a lot of his mindset, which is, in a way, the stiffer the odds, the more he wants to prove everybody wrong. And there's a certain part of that you've got to respect. But there's no doubt that you've got to size up the situation and ask yourself whether or not the message is working. And I think quite clearly, based on the polls, and not just the polls, I mean, the result in St. Paul's, which was I think a very difficult moment for the party. I mean, I was there. I was canvassing. We had volunteers there. I had people running home centers, and this is a riding that's right next to mine. So trust me, I feel it. But look, we've got this summer to sort of figure it out. I know he's reaching out to caucus, and I think that's good. My relationship with him is not just professional, it's personal too. So, I mean, I'm not inclined to talk about the conversations that we have. I'm not breaking any news with you, David, on this podcast, much as you'd like me to, but I know he's thinking it all through.
Yeah. You can be a fighter and you can have been really good in your day. But when it all ended, Muhammad Ali was getting slapped around the ring by Trevor Burbick.
Who's the Trevor Burbick here? Are we talking?
I'm saying it doesn't have to be an impressive person. It doesn't have to be your superior or even your equal. It just has to be who's better at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's truth in that, and so look, we are where we are, and I don't think there's any sugarcoating it, and I know that. Certainly, I'm thinking it through. How can we turn it around? I know lots of folks are, and I know he is. So, let's crack on, as they say, and figure it out, and figure it out fast, because these things don't just turn on a dime. I mean, I think that's the other thing. I've seen some people say, we've got time. I don't like the way that sounds. To me, that sounds complacent. It sounds like just by sheer passage of time that people will come to their senses and, have a bit of a Saul on the road to Damascus moment. Like, oh my God, we've been wrong for the last 2 years. And all of a sudden, come back to the Liberal Party or come back to Justin Trudeau. I don't think politics works like that. I think you need to have a real clarity of purpose. Like, why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we actually fighting and staying in the arena to compete? For those votes? It's because we have a certain vision about how we want the future of this country to look. And there, in my judgment, I think we've had a hard time articulating that in a way that is clear and that is relatable to the average Canadian. And I think the polls reflect that. And I think that the result in St. Paul's reflect that. And I think we've got to be, very much focused on getting that sense of clarity of purpose and clearly articulating, why do we still want to fight? Why do we still want to be the Muhammad Ali in politics, fighting whether it's Trevor Burbick or whoever wants to step into the ring? Because if we can get back into that energy, then I think we'll know why the hell we're still fighting. And people will come around to that. But, we got to get there. There's no doubt in my mind.
How might that happen? It feels like you think that they need a fundamental rethink of their policy program. When did the caucus become aware that the carbon tax was going to be unpopular, by the
way? You're saying it's unpopular. Like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? I think there are a few levers. Policy is one. But, just doing 180s for the sake of 180s also doesn't sell. Because then people start to ask, what do you stand for? Like, if you're going down, if you're ripping down the highway, I was going to say the 401, but nobody ever is ripping down the 401 because it's always gridlock.
407.
407. You're ripping down the 407, doing the max, not over, but you're doing the max, and then like you put it into neutral, then rip it into reverse. What happens to the car, right? So you got to figure out one, do you need to pivot? Two, if you're going to make a pivot, how do you pivot? And then three, how do you communicate that pivot in a way that is disciplined and relatable and authentic? And I think policy is an area where we do need to really think whether or not we need to chart out some new directions on policy, whether it's the economy or on foreign policy or on climate change. I mean, I've been very vocal about that, as you know, representing my constituents and my community, at times disagreeing with the government. That's not an easy thing to do. At times it's very difficult, but we owe it to ourselves to have the debate so that if the prime minister and the people around him at the cabinet table, and by extension, the caucus, come to the consensus that we are going to rethink some of our policy, that we do it in a way that is coherent and really, I think, explains to Canadians the why, the purpose.
Yes, but the way the framework is shaping up, an environment, a climate versus economy fight is not a fair fight in the next election.
You don't think so?
No, I don't.
Why is that?
Because I think that Canadians are dramatically less concerned about climate right now than they are about the shape of the Canadian economy, and they want a government that's focused on the economy.
And you think the two are mutually exclusive? Sorry, I'm like reversing roles here. Sorry. I shouldn't be doing
Yeah, no, well.
I'm putting you in the you're in the hot seat now.
Yeah.
Like I dodged the carbon tax question. I think that is an area that we need to look at. There's no doubt that when we did the carve out for Atlantic Canadians, that people really started to scratch their heads and ask, what is the point? And I know this is a contentious issue, particularly with, people who are who care a lot about fighting climate change and protecting the environment. And it became a lightning rod, and it has become a very difficult issue for the government to navigate. So, I think you give a good example of the types of policies that I think the government needs to think through in the path forward. But I guess what I was getting at is I don't accept, nor do I think anybody should, that figuring out how to reduce pollution should be mutually exclusive to driving a competitive economy. And I think we've got to figure that. To me, that is the why. We're fighting climate change so that we can have a competitive economy that delivers opportunity for Canadians to achieve their full potential. And I think that's the narrative that we need to kind of get back to, and do it in a way that is relatable, and not fall into some of the, I think, the rhetorical traps, and certainly the divisions that have been exploited by our opponents, who probably care a little bit less about the climate change piece.
Probably do, but at the end of 9 years, what are people seeing? They don't see any visible progress on the climate file, and they see a shitty economy, and they draw conclusions.
Fair. And all the more reason to crack on and
right.
Figure it out. And it is, part of it's policy, but a big part of it is politics. And I can't tell you the number of good ideas that I've seen come across my table that just don't get done, that don't materialize. And the reason for that is that you are competing for the resources from within government to bring them to fruition. But in order to drive them to that point, you need to bring Canadians along. You need to build that public license. And on some of these issues, that is not easy. And I think, to kind of tie this back into what we were originally talking about, how we debate these issues, focusing on the merits, having intelligent debates about climate change, about how we build the next chapters of the Canadian economy, about how we leverage the talent that is here in Canada. And yes, some of the talent that we want to attract from beyond. There are ways to do that in a way that is hopeful and optimistic and exciting, that brings Canadians along so you can drive it through the system and then deliver. And I think there's no doubt we got to pick up our game on that front, or else, Canadians are going to come to the judgment on their own and find a new government that will.
Yeah. I would argue they have already come to that judgment, and it is your job to change that judgment.
Yeah. I mean, easy job.
Marco, thanks so much for your time today. This was a great conversation.
Hey, always great. Yeah,
and
go ahead.
And an important conversation. So thanks for doing it.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Dave. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah. And good luck in your writing.
Well, I think with Scott, pushing me along at the bistro, I'll have a little extra wind in my sails.
Absolutely. Listen, thank you for your public service very much. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS. I want to thank our sponsor, CN. All you Herle Burly-ites who watch or listen to this show, thanks very much. We'll be back next week with even more Herle Burly. That's fun. See you then.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly, Herle Burly. Why